changed the title a bit because it's, the original title was even more comprehensive than this one. So this started out really as an attempt to make sense of what it means for a speech act to be conventional. But in the end, and that's an ongoing discussion in the theory of speech acts, but in the end I will talk about speech acts very little. So most of the talk will be about convention, and specifically about linguistic conventions in general, but more in particular about what I could call communicative conventions. Normally speaking, those would count as part of semantics and or pragmatics. So the question is, what are conventions, and how does whatever it is that phonologists and syntacticians and semanticists are doing, how does that relate to conventions in real life? Because that's not at all obvious. There is something like phonology, and we all know it and love it and so on. And hopefully that has some connection to the practice of everyday communication. And it's not obvious, and in particular to the conventions, i.e. phonological conventions in communication. And it's not at all obvious what the connection is. And in particular, but as I said, I'm going to talk very little about this, in what ways are speech acts conventional. So the gold standard for the notion of convention is still Lewis, 1969. This is basically a rehash of his doctoral dissertation. And he defines, I rewrote this a bit, but I think the sense is preserved in this reformulation. He defines a convention as a behavioral regularity, more in particular a kind of social regularity, so it's about social behavior. Is a convention in the population P if it is common knowledge amongst the members of P that everyone conforms to R. So the example that you should have in mind here is something like driving on the right, if that's the correct way of driving in your country. Otherwise it's driving on the left. No country drives in the middle of the road, at least not officially. Excuse me? So everyone conforms to R. The belief that others conform to R, to this regularity, gives everybody a reason, and even a decisive reason, to keep conforming. There's a preference for general conformity, so it's better if everybody conforms than if most people conform. And then the last condition ensures that this is not the only, that it's arbitrary. In principle, everybody could drive on the left. That would have been just as good. Right? But the important thing is that everybody drives either on the left or everybody drives on the right, and not a kind of mixed model. So that's, there are a number of ingredients in this that have been discussed in the literature and are found problematic. For me, an important and especially important ingredient is common knowledge. And the part that I will take exception to is this, and I'll call this general conformity. This is this idea that you can only have a convention, a social convention, if everybody conforms to it. That's, you could call that de facto conformity, and there's a preference for doing that as well. Right. So if these are conventions, then the kind of questions that I'm interested in is, what are we saying if we say that schwa is an English vowel? That's a convention of sorts, right? It's not a natural necessity. Grass is an English noun. That's a lexical convention of English. Agnes smokes grass is a declarative sentence of English, so that's a grammatical fact, a grammatical convention, and it has certain truth conditions, and that's conventional too. So how does Lewis's notion of convention apply to this? And I think the answer is, it doesn't. I mean, it's not clear how you can take that notion of convention and apply it to classify or describe these phenomena in a useful way. Okay, let's skip this one. So there are a number of problems with general conformity, but one way of making the problem as applied to language is that in language we have synonyms or near synonyms. So in English we have couch and sofa, which mean more or less the same thing. I've done some research on this, and it turns out that everybody's so confused about this that we can safely say that they mean the same thing. So any differences that there are idiosyncratic. And it's about 50-50. So half of the people say they preferably use one, and the other half use the other. Then we have heart attack and a more technical term, myocardial infarction, which seems to be the same thing. And one way of expressing sound in English is by using the word blue. And I guess that it's rather obvious that there should be a problem with applying Lewis's notion of convention to these cases, because it's not obvious how you could say in these cases that everybody should behave this way or that way, because there are crucially at least two different ways of behaving, right? And doing basically the same thing. So there can't be a rule which says if you want to refer to couches in English, you should use the word couch, because you may as well use the other. However, there's a possible response to this, and that's to rephrase the whole thing in disjunctive terms. For instance, like this: when referring to couches, speakers say or should say couch or sofa, so you get a disjunctive convention. Or maybe this is better when expressing the couch concept, or when they want to express the couch concept, speakers say or should say couch or sofa. So you make it disjunctive, and then it may fit into the Lewisian mold again. However, there are problems with this, and that problems have to do, I mean, intuitively it seems to be wrong, but you get into trouble with cases like this. Turns out, for instance, that couch was introduced into English in the Middle Ages, and sofa entered much later. So you really want to say that the couch convention preceded the sofa convention, and what you would have to say if you adopt one of the disjunctive analyses is something different. You would have to say that the couch convention predates a disjunctive convention. Another consequence is that the speaker who doesn't know the expression myocardial infarction, and until recently I was one of those, may still be use the same lexical convention for heart attack as a speaker who does. And on this disjunctive analysis, it's not clear how that could work. Okay. So general conformity doesn't seem to be required, and what that means is that this intuition that we have that conventions are in a sense imposed on us, that may be wrong. If there is a general rule, that means that everyone is supposed to obey that rule. But if you give up the idea of general conformity, something very basic changes in your intuitive notion of what a convention is. It's not something that is imposed on us by the community or by whoever imposes conventions. In Lewis's account, it's the community. But still, although quite a few authors agree these days that conventions don't require general conformity, there is a consensus that conventions are regularities of a sort. A convention has to apply, or has to have been used often enough. So that makes the couch convention a convention. It's not just that something that was said once, but it's said regularly. And I believe that in a sense that's not quite right. So I'm not going to deny that this is the case. This may be a perfectly decent way of using the term convention, but there's an issue there, right? And that's what I'm going to work on. So, and I think if you look at Lewis's motivation for introducing the notion of convention or studying conventions, then the point of the enterprise is something like this. The point of conventions is that they allow us to use past social interactions as templates or models for current ones. Conventions give us precedents, and it's these precedents that we exploit in solving coordination problems. That's the basic idea in Lewis's work. And that's also the basic idea in the literature, as far as I know. But the point is that this in itself doesn't require any degree of regularity. A precedent need only occur once and still have an effect further down the road. Okay, so you don't really need conventions if you want to capture this aspect of what it is that conventions do. So I'm going to talk about precedents. Right? So in the sense of what I'm trying to argue is that instead of conventions, it's much more useful to talk about precedents and try to understand what they are. Right? And then conventions turn out to be a special case. Right, here's a thought experiment to show that a single precedent can be enough to solve a coordination problem. So we do a thought experiment. Two people who have never met before are seated in separate rooms. So let's introduce them to each other and then we separate them. And then each of them receives the following instructions and they are identical for both. Right? So the instructions read as follows. We ask you to pick one color from the following list: green, red, blue and yellow. The other person who is sitting next door is offered the same choice. And if both of you pick the same color, you get 200 rubles each. I thought that would be enough. I'm not quite sure. If you pick different colors, you get nothing. Right? So that's a pure coordination game. So on the first trial, our subjects are lucky. They both happen to pick blue, and so they earn 200 rubles each. Right? And now we repeat the procedure with the same subjects. And the question now is, which color are they going to choose? And I think it's a safe bet. This has never been done before, but I'm pretty sure that if they are not drunk or otherwise deluded, then both will pick the same color. Right? So one precedent, which happened to work purely by luck, is on the second round seems to be the rational choice. Now it's not entirely clear why it is rational, but it certainly seems the sensible thing to do, and I'm pretty sure that most people would do it also. Okay? So this is to establish the point that one precedent is enough. And I'm pretty sure, I happen to know that there are actually there's experimental evidence. For instance, in the literature on the pragmatics of reference, which shows that a lot of referential expressions work like this. So it happens often enough that people introduce a term in a new way, which is immediately picked up by the other party. So that would be singular precedence in action. So one precedent can be enough to solve a coordination problem. So how do precedents work, and in particular, how should we see the connection between precedents and things like phonology, syntax, and so on? And how do they interact where do they come together? So the basic idea is that a precedent is an interaction in the past that serves as a template for an interaction in the present. A precedent must be common ground between two agents, for instance, between two speakers. I mean, they each must know that the other knows, etc., that there is this precedent. And it has to be salient as well, probably. But the precedent does not have to be an interaction involving A or B. Okay? This may be hearsay about other people interacting in certain ways. And precedents may be one-offs, right? There may be only one precedent, and in principle no regular conformity of any degree is required. Linguistic precedents are utterance tokens, and an utterance token may be a token of an entire sentence, but it also may be a smaller unit. For instance, if I produce the sentence Betty snores, then I have uttered the name Betty, and I have uttered the verb snores. And they are individuated, at least partly in terms of phonology, syntax, and semantics. So that's where those guys come in. And linguistic precedents may be part of the previous discourse. So this is something that happens often enough that a word is used in a context-specific way, which is then immediately picked up by the other actors or agents in the discourse. And I distinguish between at least two types of, here I should say, communicative precedents. First, there are speech acts, and I'm not going to discuss in any detail what speech acts are, but it's the kind of things that people call speech acts. And the new guy is an alignment, and that's basically any utterance that serves to get people's attentions focused on the same thing. So it presents you in a sense with a coordination problem. So if I use the word table, for instance, then I want to get us aligned on the same concept, right? And that's, in general, that's not trivial because practically every word in the language is polysemous. So it's not a trivial task. And then I want to use this abbreviation. So this looks a bit totally impressive, but it's just an abbreviation for something that is very hard to pronounce. So PT, can I point with this thing? Ah. So what this means that this is an interaction which took time at time point t in the past. Right? Alpha is an utterance of the expression alpha, and if that's the case, so if this holds, so this can be true or false, then at time t, that utterance enabled the speaker and the hearer to align on x, where x is the semantic time of alpha. So if alpha is a name, then x would be, in the simplest case, a referent, an individual. So here's, and to illustrate how this notion of precedent works, I'm giving here a simple model. Model doesn't have anything to do with model theory here, it's just a general use of the term model. And it consists of a list of clauses which claim that there has been some precedent or other. So we have two individuals, A and B, so these are the interlocutors, and it is common knowledge between them, so I'm borrowing that notion from Lewis, and then the first line says that at some point in the past, the proper name Betty was used to align on Betty 1, so Betty 1 is an individual. The second line says the same, but there the same name was used to align on Betty 2. At some point, snores was used to align on the concept snore, so this is a very simple semantics. So a concept is something that combines with an individual to produce a proposition. And here the thing becomes more intricate. This is about a syntactic construction consisting of a proper name and an intransitive verb. And at some point in the past, this was used to align on Cx, where C was the concept that was aligned on at T by beta, by means of beta, and X is the individual that was aligned by means of alpha. Right? So this is where the compositional semantics comes in. Right? So these are alignment precedents, and the others are speech act ones. So the speech act precedents have a different format. They basically say that something that at some point in the past a given sentence served a certain purpose. Right? And I have two purposes here, and that's reminding and warning. Right? And I treat the speech acts as involving a propositional content. That's not always true, but it could be true in some cases. And that's also what that sentence served to align on at that point in time. Okay? So the same expression is used twice in a way, because there are two types of precedents. Right? One is we use sentences to express propositions, and the other is we use sentences to make speeches of certain types. Okay. So what you get is that the example sentence is Betty snores, right? So this involves two other utterances, namely of Betty and snores. This means that A may, I'm going to ignore this qualifier here. So A has uttered the proper name of the form Betty in an intransitive verb with the form snores. And I'm going to assume, to keep things simple, that each of A's utterances must go back to at least one precedent. Okay? So everything is dependent on precedents, just for the purpose of the example. That means that you get 6 possible readings for this utterance. If you only take into account the precedents that I had shown. Right? So for instance, A may be reminding B that Betty 1 snores, or that Betty 2 snores. It may be a warning, or it may be both. Okay? So you get 6 possible readings. Okay? And this is just to illustrate that if you do things in remotely this type of way, you get massive ambiguity. But we know that language, or at least language conventions, radically underdetermine the interpretation of our utterances. So you get lots of ambiguity or indeterminacy, and that's resolved by Gricean reasoning, or basically it's abductive reasoning. Right? I'm not sure that it's always right to call that Gricean, but never mind. For instance, if Betty 1 is the current discourse topic, the most likely precedent for the word Betty is the one that was introduced in the first precedent. So it's Betty 1 rather than Betty 2. Let's skip this one. And I have about 2 or 3 minutes left.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's probably just skip a bit more. Right, so a convention on this account is just a type of precedents that resemble each other in certain ways. Okay, but that's already implied if you say it's a and these precedents must have occurred with at least some frequency. This is deliberately vague, and I think it is, because I think the notion of convention is vague, because there is no sharp boundary between singular precedents and real conventions. Okay? So that's one of the ways in which the notion of convention is vague, I believe. But if that's true, then the question is such and such conventional, for instance, are speech acts conventional, is vague too. And we can discuss whether that's a problem, right? But I think that's a natural consequence of this view. I don't think it's necessarily a problem, because we can deal with vague concepts, but we should be aware that this is the case. Let's do this. This is going to be my last slide. So what I've shown you is I've focused entirely on alignment conventions and speak attribute, or rather precedents which serve for alignment or to express speech acts. But conventions are more or less the same sort of thing. And then there are form conventions, and these are the kinds of conventions that are studied in phonology, morphology, etc. And I think they are something completely different. For instance, they turn to be more law-like than the others. I think that semantic conventions, or for instance alignment conventions in general, are not law-like at all. And the same goes for speech acts conventions. That's where all the indeterminacy comes from. But phonological, etc., conventions that pertain to the form of an utterance do seem to be more often law-like than the others. And the reason, I mean, there may be various reasons for this, but I think part of the story is that form conventions have a certain purpose, namely they have to restrict the set of admissible forms. If you could do anything you like in language, the number of options would be huge. And one important purpose that is served by form convention is simply that they narrow down this set of options. And that's a very different kind of thing from what communicative conventions do. Thank you very much.
Time for a short